Hello, and welcome to the Whale Hunting Podcast, where we shine a light onto the hidden worlds of money and power. I'm Bradley Hope, and this week I'm speaking to Atossa Araxia Abrahamian, journalist and now author of the new book, The Hidden Globe, about the secretive offshore zones which the rich and powerful use to bolster their wealth and consolidate their influence across the world. Good morning, Atossa. How are you?
Hey, Bradley. I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. So I was struggling before to figure out how do I describe exactly what you do with your books, because it's a kind of a combination of investigative journalism, but it has this kind of almost like cultural or philosophical dimension. I mean, is there a way that you think of it when you think of what it is you do, that your kind of angle on things?
Yeah, I would describe as like an investigative think piece, or maybe journalism done by someone who's never recovered from getting a BA in philosophy.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think that makes sense because you had your one of your earlier books, The Cosmopolites, and I just loved that it just kind of felt like exploring this in a very non-financial journalist way. You know, like it's in that zone, but it's really about, what's your kind of, there was this kind of dimension to it about what is your identity if you can buy passports, and what does it mean to be from a country and stuff. Maybe you could just kind of give a little introduction to your journey from that book to where we are now, and kind of what's emerging as your mission and as you kind of complete these books one by one.
Yeah, so the really early background is that I'm from Geneva. I grew up in Geneva, but in this very influx international community. There was diplomats, there were UN people, there were multinational employees, and so the schools I went to were packed with kids who would move every 3 years. I wasn't one of these kids. My parents were UN lifers. They didn't move from Geneva, but it still felt like, where was I living? Were we going to stay here? It wasn't. It was kind of indeterminate. And on top of that, I went to international schools, so I didn't really get a lot of Swiss history or context for the place I was living in. And on top of that, Geneva has always been a city where outsiders flock to when they're in trouble, whether it's Protestant refugees during the Reformation or oligarchs and dictators in the 20th century and now the 21st. So it's a really interesting mix of people. And I always sensed that there was something a little weird about the place I grew up in. But I could never really put my finger on it, because when you're like 9 years old, you don't know what bank secrecy is, you don't know what a free port is. You might be sort of vaguely aware that Saddam Hussein's nephew goes to your school, but you don't really know what that means either. And these things came into focus only after I left Geneva and started to work as a journalist, essentially after I finished college. And my first sort of confrontation with, I guess, the sort of world of immigration and laws and rules, in the sense that they affected me negatively. And this is a very privileged thing to say because I was in my early 20s, was that after college, I wanted to stay in the US, but I ran into a problem that I couldn't get a visa, even though I'm Canadian. It just seemed like, what's going on here? And I was like confronted with the reality of the world of nation states. Sounds so naive now, but like, truly, it takes something like that to fully realize that there are so many things outside our control. We don't get to choose where we live. We definitely don't choose where we're born. And for the vast majority of people who aren't me, it's much worse because they can't just go to Switzerland. So that really got me thinking, like, okay, I'm Canadian because I happen to be born there. What does that even mean for me? What does that mean for countries that treat me like a Canadian? What does it mean for Canada? Because like I'm the worst Canadian in the world. And it was in the back of my mind when I started working as a reporter. I was at Reuters in the beginning. And one day I got this email from a conference called the Global Citizenship and Residence Conference. And I was thinking to myself, oh, this is so cool. Like maybe it'll ask questions about what it means, what all of these questions I've been asking myself. Maybe they will have answers. But then I looked at the link and I realized that it was a conference for countries that want to sell passports and people who want to buy them. So, global citizens indeed. I convinced my editors to send me to the conference in London. I got to know some of the characters who were making this market. It was early days, 2011 or 2012. Sorry, 2012, 2013. And then I was off. I was immersed in this world of passport brokers and countries that were trying to make money by any means possible and resorting to what I started to understand as just the sort of bare fact of their sovereignty, of their status as nation states. And I started noticing all of these other ways that countries were doing this, were sort of selling themselves. And just when I say selling sovereignty, I don't mean that in a derogatory way. A lot of people will say, oh, it's like prostitution. It's terrible. It's degrading the nation. I don't feel that way. I think it's sort of a really interesting economic phenomenon and an interesting geopolitical one. So I went from looking at passport sales to looking at other ways that countries would quote unquote compromise their sovereignty or their territorial integrity. And I found all of these kind of weird jurisdictions, many of which were in Geneva. So an example of that is the Geneva Free Port. It's a warehouse. It's like near the city center. I learned to swim a few blocks away. And it's a warehouse that's outside of customs territory. So it is in Switzerland, but in certain ways, in certain tax ways, it's not in Switzerland. And it turned out that this was a place that people had been stashing, gazillions of dollars of like Picassos and gold and wine. And before that, humanitarian supplies and grain. So there's this evolution of what these spaces are used for.
And now the Hidden Globe is also kind of exploring a big theme is obviously the law, the concept of the legal jurisdiction in this little mini city. Could you talk a little bit more about that and about sort of the quirks of that?
Yeah, something I learned even early on with the passport reporting was that there's a class of people who don't think of the world as composed of nations. They think of the world as composed of jurisdictions. These are not the same. You can have a jurisdiction that is extraterritorial, meaning a sort of easiest example is a consulate or an embassy. So it's a little piece of like Hungarian law on French territory or what have you. You also have jurisdictions within countries that are not of another nation, but just separate, like a special economic zone or a free port. You have jurisdictions that can extend way into outer space, even when countries on Earth create commercial laws for, say, asteroid mining or space activities. They are kind of throwing their jurisdiction way out there. And so it doesn't make sense to think of it as territorial at all. And that was really key. That's really key, I think, to understanding the Hidden Globe and the ideas inside it, because this law and land are kind of divorced. In a lot of cases, law and land are one and the same, but that there is nothing necessary about that relationship.
I like this concept that you also described of, when we think of the world, we think of all these borders and how they're meaningful to us in some way, that if you get across the border, you can escape the previous country or whatever it might be. But in reality, because of all of these projections and, quirks of how things are set up, that's not really the borders that we really know. That really, I think you call it the sort of invisible boundaries that we don't necessarily perceive visually the same way. So I'd love to hear you talk about that. And also, I wondered if it also kind of goes to this idea of, if you're a financial criminal or a kleptocrat, you're trying to be outside the border of the U.S. jurisdiction as much as possible. You're trying to find ways to stay outside of that border. Maybe you could also speak about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think we're, if there was once a time when your identity was, you show a piece of paper at a border, it's not linked to a computer, there's no biometrics, your bank transactions are not traced, like this is, really old school, then we may be able to talk about a border as something you cross and then it's over. I don't think it was ever that simple, but for the sake of argument. And now I think the border is around us. It's around our legal identity. It's around our bodies. It's around our money. And the reason that so many kleptocrats want to be outside of a U.S. jurisdiction is because, well, there's sanctions, right? There's sanctions on what they can do with their money and where they can go without facing asset freezing or arrest. This is not just for kleptocrats. I mean, this is also for people who might be accused of war crimes. Like during the Bush years, there was, I don't know if this is entirely true, but apparently the Bush administration, many members of it wouldn't go to Europe because they were scared of getting nailed by The Hague, right? So there's a human rights aspect to this as well. It's not just money. The fortunate thing for all of these characters, whether we're talking about Benjamin Netanyahu or Gaddafi, is that there are other countries that are totally willing to accommodate them. Lately, this place seems like it has been Dubai. Dubai has been, very accommodating of what some people might call dirty money and human rights abuses. But I think even if Dubai were to vanish tomorrow, there would be, a litany of places looking to replace it because it's really lucrative.
It almost feels like if you are wealthy and powerful in some way and knowledgeable, that there's this set of tools, or they're almost like a set of boxes that you can use. There can be a box that you put yourself inside. There's even a box you can put a gun inside and no one can look inside the box, like a diplomatic pouch, and it feels like this is the world of a kind of obscure set of tools and boxes that completely are the center of how people can retain power, use money, and to influence the world in ways that we don't really perceive every day.
Yeah, definitely. To use just maybe a more well-known corporate example, when you're looking at a company and then you find out that that owns another company and that owns another company and another company, it's like nesting dolls, like the Russian dolls. I think people will do that for their person, their assets, their trusts. And I guess I've sort of come to think of it as like when you see this world, when you see this parallel world of like options and exits, you can't unsee it. And maybe it's not even you, nasty dictator who sees it. These people have tons of other professionals working for them whose job it is to see that for them and to get them into these structures and offshore vehicles. So it's unbelievably clever. We can talk about whether it's good or bad, but what we can, I think, agree on is it's very clever. And there are people who really specialize in this. This is their whole career.
Yeah. One of the great tricks is never to own anything, but to be able to use it as much as you want, right? So there's some sort of an asset that owns it and it loans it to another asset. And in reality, you're just using the yacht like anybody would ever use a yacht. But if you look at the paperwork, there's no way to say that you actually own it.
Yeah, the layers of fictitiousness, like what's real, what's not real, it really can like start messing with your head because you're like, well, this ship is here and it belongs to this person and it's in this country, but actually it's not here and it's under another country's flag and apparently nobody owns it. And this is like a giant ship, right? You can't just make it, it's clearly there. So there's a certain element of like gaslighting where you see something, but you're constantly being told it's not there or it's not real. And it's all illusions,
Yeah. Definitely. I think another big example of what you're describing is Saudi Arabia with NEOM. And I think in that case, it's almost sort of, you can sort of see the utility of these special zones with special laws because it's very difficult to reform a country's laws. If you have an idea, if you're the new king or a new crown prince of a country, you want to change the laws or the increase permissiveness, like, for example, allow alcohol to be sold or whatever it might be. It's a tricky thing to do that for the whole country. So NEOM, this kind of weird experimental space, one of the things they did from the very beginning was hire a law firm to start writing the laws of this place, which are different than the laws of Saudi Arabia. But it's so weird because even in NEOM, there's been consideration in some of that legal discussion if Saudi Arabian citizens would need a visa to visit Neom because it's so futuristic and so culturally different, reinvented, that it might be a bit too abrupt of a transition, and maybe not everyone can pass the approvals to visit this part of their own country.
Yeah, that reminds me of how Singapore has a thriving gambling industry, but you can't be a Singaporean citizen to participate because they want to keep the sin for the outsiders. But the sort of the foundation, like the theory of a special economic zone among a certain type of economist is you're not just putting this on a country's territory to give a concession to the corporate actor that's occupying it. You're doing this with the idea that you're testing new things and that if they work, you can bring them onshore. And so you're not doing this forever. You're not kind of having this ghetto or enclave on a permanent basis. It's a place to try out stuff that might not fly right away. Historically, that has been the case for free ports as well. Colonial free ports might have allowed certain types of trade that would not have passed muster between, warring sovereigns or warring imperialists. So I think that in that respect, Neom is like right on the ball. Like they see the utility of these types of spaces. Of course, there's a massive amount of cynicism behind this, right? Like a place like Saudi wants to have its cake and eat it too. They want to have foreign investment and tourism. They also want to have a theocracy. And like, sure, maybe MBS is a little bit more progressive or whatever than his predecessors, but like this is still a fundamentally self-interested move. And it is one that is intended to make the country money and improve / launder its reputation. It isn't a neutral and altruistic thing to do.
Yeah, but I think it also just sort of brings me back to this question that you're exploring to some extent about identity, because there was obviously a period of time when borders were very fuzzy, and people just kind of lived in communities, and there wasn't really nation states. And then maybe the last creation of a state was the creation of Israel or something like that. And then sometimes we see borders moving now because of conflict in Ukraine and Russia. But for the most part, all those borders feel very like solid now, very fixed. And the only tool left is these special zones. And I think also, which we can talk about next, outer space is kind of the next frontier of space building or whatever. But what were some of the thoughts that went through your head as you imagined how the world is evolving, and even the sense of identity? I mean, there's a type of person now. There's what do they call third culture kids like us. Both of us had this kind of living in these kind of international schools. But there's also kind of, I don't know, if you're born in Dubai, but you have a passport from Grenada and bank accounts in the Seychelles and, no real connection to where your family is from originally. I feel like there's this new type of person that's kind of emerging or something.
Yeah. Yeah, I think about this a ton because I'm seeing now that people I grew up with in Geneva who were not Swiss, whose parents are not Swiss, who were kind of plopped there for professional reasons. They went to, elementary school and high school in Geneva, went abroad for college, worked for a few years, and now we're moving back there because it's such a good quality of life in Geneva and the world is a shit show. And what are they? I asked a few friends this last summer, like, do you think of yourself as an expat still? Do you think of yourself as Swiss? It's just a very muddled sense of identity. And they're like, well, a little bit of both, a little bit Swiss, a little bit not. And I think that they're muddling through this as much as we are. I do think this is a new kind of person. And I don't really know what the implications of it are going to be on a broader scale because it's not that many people, I guess. But these are people who have a disproportionate amount of wealth and power and sort of cultural capital. So we'll have to see. I'm also very interested in this digital nomad trend and how long that's going to last. Because if the last generation of golden visas and golden passports were for really, really rich people, now there's a whole class of visa for like mobile techie types who are untethered from anywhere. They don't have families or major responsibilities that are keeping them in place. And how long is that going to last? Like, are they just the backpackers who have become professional, or like that's another type of expat that is pretty. It's something to watch.
Yeah. Yeah, there's also kind of the crypto utopians that are kind of setting up their own communities where all the values are very Randian and different. And but I do feel like there's something quite dystopian about the young digital nomad living in a giant tower in Dubai with no real ties in the world, no real assets. Everything's rented. Everything's, controlled through these different, you know, spaces, and something about it feels a bit empty, I guess. But maybe I'm just like nostalgic and old fashioned or something.
It's bleak. I think what you're getting at is that, like, what's your community? Forget nations, forget national, citizenship. Like, let's say that stuff isn't as important as it has been made out to be. You still need people. You still need community. You still want to be able to show up somewhere and to be recognized by somebody. And if you're not, then that's when it gets pretty alienating. And I think that's also the reason that, in spite of my very muddled identity, I've lived in New York. I mean, I'm sort of a diehard New Yorker now, and I'm not leaving Brooklyn. And I guess that's very provincial of me at the same time. But I like being able to go outside and bump into my friend who's walking the dog.
Yeah. Well, can you speak a little bit about how you became a citizen of this extraterrestrial nation, as it called, Asgardia?
Yeah, Asgardia. So I'm a lapsed citizen because I didn't want to keep paying for the fee. So, spoiler. But this was when I was thinking about the passport sales, and what does it mean to be a country, to have countries. And at some point in this trajectory of this journey I've been on, I was kind of kicking around this notion of, like, well, why aren't there more countries? Maybe there should be. Maybe this would solve some problems that we have in the world. Like, maybe we just need more. And it turns out that starting new countries actually just creates a lot of problems. Whether we're talking about South Sudan, which has had lots of problems, or you pointed out Israel, oh boy, are there problems, right? Like, for everybody. So maybe starting new countries isn't the answer. But anyway, at this point, I was also thinking of, what does a country look like if it doesn't have territory? Because for a couple of years, the discourse around climate change was that all of these island nations are going to disappear. And then what? Will they continue to have sovereignty and a leader? And will they just rent territory abroad? Will they no longer be countries and lose their status at the UN? How do you have a country without territory? Well, these Asgardians came up with an idea of having a space-based country, which for a time was their territory was a satellite. And now I think it's not even that. So I learned about this. I was like, wow, this is really interesting. I'm going to sign up. So I signed up and I went on the Discord, and it was just like a lot of Star Trek, which is really not my jam. I don't really like to watch that stuff. But, it was a pretty cool thing to watch people really invest in this idea that we're going to start a country from scratch, and it's experimental for now, but maybe it will lead to something. You can argue that any number of microscopic tax havens, should they be countries or not? Like, should something that came up when I was working on this book is that Luxembourg is just takes a disproportionate amount of wealth from other states and funnels them through. But Luxembourg is tiny. Some people say it lacks a distinct culture. It does not even have its own central bank. So, like, is it a country? And actually, an economist, Gabriel Zuckman, was like, no, like, this isn't a country. This is more like a floating platform in the ocean. And that's really bad because it's siphoning away resources from everywhere else. So I guess the question to ask is then, like, is there such a huge difference between a Luxembourg and a space-based, experiment? And of course, the answer is yes, because people live in Luxembourg and they're real. But it's a question worth asking.
Well, you could almost argue that Asgardia potentially has a stronger sense of identity and culture, because you said in that Discord channel, those guys are super enthusiastic. potentially would be happier to emblazon the flag of Asgardia on themselves more so than the country where they actually live. But so the other thing about space that's interesting is, theoretically, as I understand it, and you can correct me, but nobody has any territory in space. Like, it's kind of like Antarctica. It's sort of uncharted territory where you can go. But there's a lot of interesting legal implications, because if you have space mining, if your spaceship crashes into another spaceship, who pays for that? What's the court? And one time I wrote an article about a guy who lived in a normal house in California, but he was the chief lawyer at a space mining company, and he was sitting around in his garage with like Star Wars posters on the walls, really trying to think through some of this like space tort problems.
Yeah, that's incredible. I need to read that story because I think I would really like it. Yeah. So, but yes, you can't claim territory in space. There's obviously nobody in space making rules unique to space. And so it kind of defaults to Earth's rules and countries on Earth, which is how you get a scenario where, again, a country like Luxembourg is passing legislation that recognizes private property in outer space, opening the doors to space miners and asteroid miners and what have you. And it's, again, I'm not saying it's good or bad. Like, maybe this is it's more of the same, but we don't really think of space as a venue for more of the same. We think of space as like totally different and like literally out of this world. And yet we are just repeating the same things that we have done on Earth in outer space.
Absolutely. Well, I'm gonna join the Asgardia Discord channel after this. I need to see this for myself. But thank you very much for joining us on Whale Hunting. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Bradley. This is really fun.
That's it for this week. Thanks to Atossa for joining us. You can pre-order her new book, The Hidden Globe, now, or pick it up in bookshops from the 8th of October in the US and next February in the UK. If you're enjoying whale hunting, make sure to check out our website at whalehunting.projectbrazen.com, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week for more.
Whale Hunting is a production of Project Brazen. It's hosted by me, Tom Wright, and Bradley Hope. It's produced by Megan Dean, Claire Urban, and Arnav Vinaikia. At Project Brazen, Mariangel Gonzalez is our project manager, and Charlie Barlow is associate producer. Ryan Ho is the creative director, with additional design from Andrea Claridge.